November 11th, 1630. The Luxembourg Palace, Paris. The air is thick, not with incense, but with the suffocating perfume of conspiracy. It clings to the tapestries, a cloying mix of sweat, expensive fabrics, and animal fear. This is the narrative of him, the man they thought was finished. The sound is a low, triumphant hum from behind closed doors, the murmur of the Queen Mother, Marie de Medici, and her allies as they celebrate their victory. Outside, in the antechamber, the silence is a physical weight, broken only by the frantic, shallow breathing of the few who remain loyal to the fallen minister. Cardinal Armand Jean du Plessis de Richelieu has been politically executed. He had come to plead his case to the king, his master, only to find the door bolted on the order of the king's own mother. A fatal miscalculation. Through the heavy oak, he can almost hear the tearing of his life's work, the sound of France being dragged back into the feudal darkness by grasping nobles and a vengeful queen. The light is dim, the November gloom pressing against the palace windows, mirroring the eclipse of his own fortunes. For a single, heart-stopping moment, he is just a man again, a 45-year-old invalid, his body a frail vessel of constant pain, his political life in ruins. He can smell his own defeat, a bitter, metallic tang of despair. His enemies are already dividing the spoils, imagining his exile, perhaps even his imprisonment in the Bastille. This was the moment known to history as the Day of the Dupe, the day Richelieu was supposed to break. To understand how he turned this absolute catastrophe into the cornerstone of his absolute power, how this priest in a scarlet robe transformed the dark art of intrigue into a divine right of the state, we must return to the world that spawned both the man and the monster. This was the saga of Armand Jean du Plessis, a man who would teach a king how to be a king, and a nation how to be a nation. The central burning paradox of his existence was how this prince of the Catholic Church, sworn to God, would come to serve a new, colder deity, the state. How did he, a man haunted by physical frailty, marshal the strength to break the wills of the most powerful nobles in Europe, using whispers, spies, and armies with equal terrifying skill? The question is not simply what he did, but how. How did he reforge the very soul of politics, transforming courtly intrigue, that selfish, venomous game of personal advancement, into raison d'etat, a sacred and ruthless weapon for the glory of France? To answer this, we must first understand the stage upon which he played his deadly game. It was a world where loyalty was a commodity, and the blade of a hired assassin was a common tool of diplomacy. He inherited a France that was less a kingdom and more a chaotic patchwork of feudal loyalties, religious strife, and aristocratic arrogance, a nation hemmed in by enemies and rotting from within. His life's work would be to take this fractured vessel and hammer it, through sheer force of will, into a modern, centralized war machine. He was the architect, and the price of his materials would be measured in blood, treasure, and the immortal souls of those who served him, starting with his own. His story is not one of a good man, but of a necessary one, a testament to the terrifying truth that great historical enterprises are often built upon a foundation of great and terrible sins. To understand this man, we must return to the world of the early 17th century, a world teetering on the edge of a blade. This was not yet the France of gilded sunlight that would be built at Versailles. This was a wounded, vulnerable kingdom caught in a geopolitical death grip. We must zoom out from the perfumed corridors of the Louvre to see the grand, bloody chessboard of Europe. To the south and east, the House of Habsburg loomed like a two-headed eagle, a Catholic colossus of Spain and the Holy Roman Empire that encircled France in an iron ring of steel and gold. The Spanish tercios, the most feared infantry in the world, were masters of the continent, their galleons laden with the silver of the New World, funding an endless war. In the heart of Europe, the 30 Years' War was raging, a hellish vortex of religious fanaticism and political ambition that was bleeding Germany white, a conflict that Richelieu watched with the cold, calculating eye of a vulture. He saw not a religious catastrophe, but a strategic opportunity, a fire that could be stoked to consume his Habsburg rivals. To the north, across the gray waters of the Channel, was Protestant England, an unpredictable and meddlesome power, ever ready to exploit French weakness by supporting the Huguenot rebels within France's own borders. And within France itself, the kingdom was a viper's nest of sedition. The great nobles, the princes of the blood, still thought and acted like medieval warlords, viewing the king not as their absolute master, but as the first among equals. Their private armies and fortified castles, a constant challenge to the authority of the crown. The Huguenots, the French Protestants, formed a state within a state, a powerful military and political faction with its own loyalties, its own foreign allies, and its own agenda. This was the world Richelieu was born into, a weak king, a restive nobility, a divided faith, and a circle of ravenous enemies. France was not a predator, it was prey. It was precisely this state of near-terminal crisis that forged his unbending conviction that for France to survive, it needed not a consensus, but a single, absolute, unwavering will. His will. The forging of this iron will begin not in the corridors of power, but in the damp, provincial obscurity of Poitou, within the decaying walls of the family chateau. Armand Jean du Plessis was born into a paradox, a family of ancient nobility that was teetering on the edge of financial ruin. He was the third son, a position that in the rigid hierarchy of the time was an ancestral curse. The first son inherited the lands, the second son was destined for the army, and the third, by default, was given to the church. This was not a calling, it was a sentence. The young Armand dreamed not of the pulpit, but of the battlefield. He longed for the feel of a sword in his hand, for the glory of a cavalry charge, but his path was chosen for him. The bishopric of Lausanne, a dreary, impoverished diocese his family clung to as their last significant source of income. This destiny was compounded by a cruel irony. A mind forged for command was trapped in a body that was a temple of suffering. From his youth, he was plagued by debilitating migraines, fevers, and a nervous frailty that would torment him his entire life. It was this constant, grinding battle with his own physical weakness that bred in him a contempt for the weakness of others and a superhuman discipline. Denied the straightforward path to glory through military might, he was forced to cultivate the only weapon he had, a fearsome, cold, and penetrating intellect. His years as the young Bishop of Lausanne were his wilderness. He threw himself into his studies with a desperate ferocity, mastering theology, rhetoric, and political theory, transforming a provincial backwater into his personal forge. He learned there that power did not always come from the sword, but from the word, not from the fortress wall, but from the secret whispered behind it. This impoverished aristocrat, this sickly churchman, was nursing an ambition as vast and as cold as the winter sky over his diocese, an ambition to escape his fate and impose his will not just on a parish, but on the world. His first step onto the great stage of France was a master class in calculated opportunism. The stage was the Estates General of 1614, a grand, chaotic assembly of the clergy, nobility, and commoners, the first such gathering in decades. The kingdom was adrift. King Henry IV, the great unifier, was dead by an assassin's hand, and his young son, Louis XIII, was a boy king overshadowed by the immense, domineering presence of his mother, the regent Marie de Medici. The assembly was a cacophony of grievances and competing interests, a perfect microcosm of the fractured state of the realm. Into this chaos stepped the 29-year-old Bishop of Lucon, chosen to deliver the final closing address on behalf of the clergy. Where others saw a forum for complaint, Richelieu saw an audition. He did not speak like a provincial bishop. He spoke like a minister of state. His voice, clear and cold, cut through the chamber's humid air. He ignored petty clerical issues and spoke of national unity, of the majesty of the throne, of the need for order and a strong hand to guide the ship of state through treacherous waters. It was a speech of breathtaking audacity and political genius. He flattered the Queen Mother. He praised the young king. But his true message was aimed directly at the heart of power. He was presenting himself not as a supplicant, but as a solution. He was demonstrating that he, and he alone, understood the great game. The chroniclers report that a hush fell over the assembly. The great nobles saw an upstart. But Marie de Medici, an Italian who understood the subtleties of power, saw something else entirely, a tool. Here was a churchman with no great army or fortune of his own, a man whose ambition was therefore tied entirely to the favor of the crown. She saw a brilliant, articulate, and seemingly loyal servant who could help her navigate the treacherous currents of the court. She had just found her weapon, and he, in turn, had just found his patron. The game had begun. Behind the calculated ambition and the cold intellect lay an inner demon, a secret motivation that was far more powerful than a mere desire for wealth or titles. To understand Richelieu, one must understand that he was a true believer, but his God was not the one worshipped in the cathedrals of Paris. His deity was the abstract concept of the state, an entity he believed to be eternal, sacred, and above the petty concerns of mortal men, even the king himself. This was a radical, almost heretical idea in an age where the kingdom was still seen as the personal property of the monarch. For Richelieu, the king was merely the first servant of the state, its living embodiment, and his own role was that of a high priest, tasked with protecting its sanctity against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This fanatical devotion was fueled by a deeply personal grievance. He harbored a profound, aristocratic contempt for the disorder that had plagued France during the wars of religion, a chaos he blamed on the selfish ambitions of the great nobles and the divisive poison of religious factionalism. He saw their quests for personal power as a sacrilege against the holiness of a unified France. Compounding this was his own physical frailty. In a world dominated by warrior aristocrats, his sickly constitution was a source of deep-seated insecurity. He could not dominate men with his body, so he would dominate them with his mind. He would prove that the intellect, the will, the strategic genius of one man was more powerful than 1,000 private armies. His ambition was not just to serve France, but to remake it in his own image, logical, centralized, disciplined, and utterly ruthless in its pursuit of glory. He did not seek to be loved. He sought to be obeyed, not for his own sake, but for the sake of the immortal institution he served. This burning, impersonal fanaticism was the engine of his entire life, the force that allowed him to send thousands to their deaths, to betray alliances, and to sacrifice every principle of his clerical calling on the cold altar of raison d'etat. The path from the bishop's pulpit to the king's council was paved by his fateful and ultimately fatal alliance with the Queen Mother, Marie de Medici. But the defining relationship of his life, the one that would both empower and torment him, was his encounter with the strange, melancholic man who wore the crown, King Louis XIII. Louis was nothing like his charismatic, swashbuckling father, Henry IV. He was a deeply pious, shy, and insecure ruler, plagued by a stutter and a profound sense of inadequacy. He found the daily business of ruling to be an excruciating burden and was more at home on the hunting field or in the army camp than in the council chamber. He was a king who did not want to rule, but who was terrified of appearing weak. This psychological complexity was the key that Richelieu, the master manipulator, turned to unlock supreme power. He understood that Louis craved order, strength, and glory for his kingdom, but lacked the will, the confidence, or the ruthlessness to achieve it himself. Richelieu positioned himself as the perfect instrument of the king's latent desires. He became the iron will that Louis lacked, the decisive hand that the king was too hesitant to play. Their relationship was a bizarre codependency. The cardinal would present his ruthless plans not as his own ambitions, but as the necessary, logical fulfillment of the king's own greatness. He worked tirelessly, absorbing the hatred and envy of the entire court, allowing Louis to remain above the fray, the pure, anointed symbol of the nation, while his minister did the dirty work. Louis, in turn, found in Richelieu a man whose towering intellect he could respect and whose loyalty to the crown, if not to him personally, was absolute. He both resented and relied upon his brilliant minister. He was the only man the king could trust to be as ruthless as the times required. It was this strange, complex, and deeply personal alliance between a weak king and his dominant minister that formed the political bedrock for the creation of absolute monarchy in France. The moment Richelieu was appointed to the royal council and swiftly became the first minister in 1624, the velvet glove of the bishop was stripped away to reveal the iron fist of the statesman. The price of power was immediate and bloody. The kingdom he now effectively governed was festering with rebellion, and the most virulent infection was the Huguenot stronghold of La Rochelle. This port city on the Atlantic coast was more than just a bastion of French Protestantism. It was a republic within the kingdom, a wealthy, defiant maritime power with its own fleet, its own treasury, and, most dangerously, its own foreign policy, deeply entwined with France's enemy, England. For Richelieu, this was an intolerable cancer on the body of the state. His first major act was not a negotiation, but a declaration of war. He saw clearly that before France could confront its external enemies, it had to be master in its own house. The decision to move against the Huguenots was the first demonstration of his cold, pragmatic philosophy. Though a cardinal of the Catholic Church, he approached the problem not as a religious crusade, but as a political necessity. He famously stated that his goal was not to destroy Protestantism as a faith, but to obliterate it as a political faction. This distinction was lost on the battlefield. The first campaigns were brutal, a taste of the ruthlessness that would become his trademark. He began the slow, methodical process of isolating La Rochelle, building forts, and commissioning a new royal navy capable of challenging the English ships that supplied the city. The first blood was shed, the first compromises with his conscience were made, and the great nobles of the court watched in horror and fascination. They were witnessing the emergence of a new kind of power, one that did not play by the old feudal rules of honorable warfare and aristocratic privilege. This was a power based on logistics, finance, and an unwavering, singular objective: the absolute and total supremacy of the central state. The price of this power was a civil war, and it was a price the cardinal was more than willing to pay. The primary antagonist in Richelieu's grand strategy was not a single man, but a sprawling, dynastic monster, the House of Habsburg. This was the macro-level threat that dictated his every move on the European chessboard. For over a century, the Habsburgs had dominated the continent, their power split between two mighty branches, the Spanish monarchy in Madrid and the Holy Roman Emperors in Vienna. This familial alliance controlled a vast and terrifying swathe of the world, from the silver mines of Peru to the rich ports of the Netherlands, from the heart of Germany to the boot of Italy. For France, this was an existential threat. A map of the period shows France caught in a suffocating embrace, an iron pincer of Habsburg territories on its southern, eastern, and even northern borders. Richelieu's entire foreign policy was a desperate, 30-year struggle to break this encirclement. He saw the ongoing 30 Years' War in Germany not as the religious conflict it purported to be, but as a colossal civil war within the Habsburg sphere of influence. It was a God-sent opportunity to bleed his rivals dry. This defined the central scandalous paradox of his career. To save Catholic France, the Catholic cardinal would prop up, fund, and encourage the Protestant princes of Germany and the Protestant king of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus. He practiced a ruthless form of geopolitics, a ministry of subsidy, paying others to do the fighting and dying against the Habsburgs that France could not yet afford to do itself. This grand continental struggle was the backdrop for everything. The internal enemies he crushed, the nobles and the Huguenots, were dangerous precisely because they were potential clients of the Habsburg juggernaut. Every decision, every tax, every conspiracy he uncovered was ultimately connected to this titanic struggle for the very survival and future of France as a major power in Europe. Every great gambler makes a fatal mistake, a moment of hubris that brings him to the brink of ruin. For Richelieu, this came on November 11th, 1630, the infamous day of the dupe. The psychological breaking point occurred in the claustrophobic confines of the Luxembourg Palace. For years, the Queen Mother, Marie de Medici, his one-time patron, had grown to despise him, seeing him as a venomous serpent who had stolen her son's affection and warped the policy of the state. She represented the pro-Spanish, devoutly Catholic faction at court, and she finally made her move. She cornered her son, King Louis XIII, and delivered a tearful, furious ultimatum. It was either his mother or his minister. In a moment of weakness, Louis appeared to buckle. Richelieu, arriving to plead his case, found himself physically barred from the king's presence, the doors locked. In that moment of humiliation, hearing the triumphant celebration of his enemies from within, he believed his career was over. He began packing his bags for exile, the entire edifice of his life's work crumbling around him. But as his enemies celebrated prematurely, duping themselves, Richelieu made one last, desperate gamble. He discovered a secret entrance to the king's new residence at Versailles, then a modest hunting lodge. He found the king alone, melancholic and wavering. In a conversation that would decide the fate of France, Richelieu did not beg. He argued, reasoned, and laid bare the cold, hard logic of his policies. He forced Louis to choose not between his mother and his minister, but between two futures for France, a return to weak, faction-ridden subservience to Spain, or the difficult, glorious path to supremacy. Louis, the hesitant king, made the most decisive choice of his life. He chose the state. He chose Richelieu. The next day, the cardinal's enemies were arrested and exiled. This experience carved a deep scar into Richelieu's soul. He understood in that moment of near annihilation that power was a constant, merciless war, that there could be no compromise, and that any rival, no matter how close, must be politically, and sometimes physically, destroyed. Having survived his own political death, Richelieu learned to transform the chaos of conspiracy into an instrument of order. He came to understand that the constant plots of the high nobility were not just a threat, they were an opportunity. Each new treasonous scheme became a public lesson in the new politics of absolutism. The case of the Comte de Chalais in 1626 was the first masterclass. Chalais was a foolish young nobleman drawn into a convoluted plot against the cardinal, a plot that involved the king's own brother, Gaston d'Orléans. When the conspiracy was uncovered, Richelieu could have simply exiled the ringleaders, as was the aristocratic custom. Instead, he chose to make an example. He had Chalais arrested, subjected to a show trial, and condemned to death for the crime of lèse-majesté, an attack not just on a minister, but on the sacred authority of the king himself. The execution was deliberately gruesome and public, a piece of political theater designed to send a shockwave of fear through the aristocracy. An even greater lesson came with the rebellion of Henri de Montmorency in 1632. Montmorency was no mere courtier. He was the governor of Languedoc, a peer of the realm, and the scion of one of the oldest and most powerful families in France. His open rebellion, in league with foreign powers, was a direct challenge to the very idea of a centralized state. When he was defeated and captured, the entire nobility pleaded for his life, believing his rank made him untouchable. Richelieu was unbending. He convinced the king that to pardon Montmorency would be a sign of fatal weakness. Montmorency was publicly beheaded in Toulouse. The message was brutally clear. The age of feudal privilege was over. No one, regardless of bloodline, was above the law of the state. He had weaponized their own treason against them, using each plot to prune the dangerously overgrown branches of the nobility and strengthen the trunk of royal authority. The greatest triumph of Richelieu's career, the climax of his campaign to unify France internally, was the monumental siege of La Rochelle. This was not merely a battle, it was an epic of engineering, willpower, and political theater that lasted for more than a year, from September 1627 to October 1628. The city was a formidable Protestant fortress, a wealthy port whose massive walls were considered impregnable. Its true strength, however, came from the sea. La Rochelle was the key entry point for English aid, a naval lifeline that allowed it to defy the French crown indefinitely. The English fleet, under the command of the Duke of Buckingham, made repeated attempts to relieve the city. Richelieu knew that, as long as the port remained open, La Rochelle could never be taken. It was here that he demonstrated the sheer scale of his ambition and the terrifying power of his logistical genius. He, a cardinal who had dreamed of being a soldier, became the supreme commander of the royal army. His solution to the English fleet was audacious. He ordered the construction of a gigantic sea mole, a stone dike nearly a mile long and 80 feet wide, completely sealing off the city's harbor from the Atlantic. Thousands of laborers and soldiers worked day and night, sinking barges filled with stone, driving piles into the seabed, mounting cannons on the structure itself. It was a Herculean undertaking, a wonder of 17th century engineering, and a testament to the cardinal's unbending will. He lived in the camps among his soldiers, directing the work, surviving assassination attempts, and holding the army together through a brutal winter. When the last English relief fleet saw the completed mole and sailed away in defeat, the fate of the city was sealed. The surrender of La Rochelle, its population decimated by starvation, was more than a military victory. It was the symbolic death of feudal and religious separatism in France, a brutal and spectacular announcement that from this moment on, there was only one power in the kingdom: the king, as guided by his cardinal. At the moment of his greatest triumph, standing on the completed sea mole at La Rochelle, with the starved city at his mercy and the English fleet disappearing over the horizon, we must attempt to enter the mind of the cardinal. This was his moment of hubris, but it was a cold and impersonal pride, devoid of simple joy. He did not see himself as a vengeful conqueror, nor as a religious crusader celebrating a victory for Catholicism. He saw himself as a surgeon who had just completed a painful but necessary operation to save the life of his patient, France. The chroniclers describe him at this time as detached, tireless, and utterly focused. He looked upon the suffering of the Rochellais, not with sadistic pleasure, but with a chilling sense of abstract necessity. They were the diseased limb, and he was the one with the courage to perform the amputation. This victory solidified his core belief that the good of the state was a form of higher morality that superseded all other ethical considerations. He had starved thousands of French subjects, but he had saved the unity of the kingdom. He had defied the might of England and proven the power of the French crown. In his mind, the means were sanctified by the glorious end. This was also a deeply personal vindication. The sickly boy from Poitou, the frustrated soldier forced into a cassock, had just outgeneraled the greatest military powers of his day through pure intellect and will. He had proven that the mind was a mightier weapon than the sword. This moment cemented his fusion with the identity of the state. His will was France's will. His enemies were France's enemies. He was no longer a minister serving the king. He was the high priest of a new, secular religion, and La Rochelle was his first and greatest sacrifice on its altar. To understand the intensity of Richelieu's political battles, we must zoom in from the macro-level threat of the Habsburgs to the intimate, personal venom of his rivalry with the Queen Mother, Marie de Medici. This was not a conflict of policies, but a psychological war, a bitter feud between a patron and her creation that came to represent the death throes of one political world and the birth of another. Marie, a proud Florentine princess from the House of Medici, was a woman who understood power in deeply personal, familial, and transactional terms. She had elevated the obscure Bishop of Luçon, and she expected unwavering personal loyalty in return. She could not comprehend his devotion to the abstract idea of the state, especially when his policies, like aligning with Protestant powers against Catholic Spain, seemed to be a betrayal of everything she and the devout Catholic party stood for. Their conflict was a clash of chemistries. She was emotional, ruled by her affections and hatreds. He was cold, analytical, and utterly unsentimental. The drama peaked during the Day of the Dupes, where she saw the struggle in maternal terms, a battle for the heart of her son, the king. When Louis ultimately sided with Richelieu, she saw it not as a political decision, but as a monstrous act of personal betrayal and filial ingratitude. For Richelieu, his sworn enemy was not the woman herself, but the world she embodied. She represented the old way of doing things, a government run by favorites, where foreign policy was dictated by marriage alliances and religious sentiment, and where the interests of the royal family were placed above the interests of the nation. His victory over her was therefore more than personal. It was ideological. By exiling his own former patron, he sent a terrifying message to the entire court. Personal loyalties, even to the mother of the king, were now secondary to the impersonal and absolute demands of the state. It was the final, brutal severing of the medieval world from the modern. While Richelieu's fame rests on his ruthless statecraft and diplomacy, his true genius lay in his understanding that wars are won not just on the battlefield, but in the council chambers and the treasury. He was not just a politician, he was a builder, forging the very instruments of a modern state that France had previously lacked. His most significant and lasting reform was the creation of a powerful French navy. He was horrified by the fact that the kingdom, with 2 coastlines, was dependent on rented ships and lacked the power to protect its own commerce or challenge England and Spain at sea. Appointing himself Grand Master of Navigation, he oversaw a massive state-funded program of shipbuilding, harbor fortification, and naval administration. By the end of his life, he had built a fleet from virtually nothing, a tool that would be essential for France's future colonial and commercial ambitions. Just as he sought to centralize military power, he sought to centralize cultural power. In 1635, he founded the Académie Française, an institution tasked with standardizing and purifying the French language. This was a profoundly political act. By creating a single official French, he sought to erode regional dialects and identities, forging a unified national culture that revolved around the authority of Paris and the crown. Perhaps his most effective tool of centralization was the expansion and empowerment of the intendants. These were centrally appointed royal officials, usually from the professional class rather than the high nobility, who were dispatched to the provinces with broad powers over justice, finance, and policing. They were the eyes, ears, and hands of the king, bypassing the traditional authority of the local aristocratic governors and imposing the will of the central government directly upon the people. The navy, the academy, the intendants, these were the bureaucratic nuts and bolts, the administrative infrastructure of the absolute state he was constructing. Woven into the grand tapestry of geopolitics and state-building was a darker, more secret thread, the world of espionage and intelligence. Richelieu was the master of what became known as the Cabinet Noir, or Black Chamber, arguably the most sophisticated and feared intelligence service in Europe. He understood that information was power, and he built an unprecedented network of spies, informants, and agents that stretched from the Protestant courts of Germany to the heart of the Spanish Escorial, and most importantly, into every corner of the French aristocracy. Letters were secretly opened, read, copied, and resealed by expert cryptographers. Servants were paid to report on the pillow talk of their noble masters. Dissident priests, disgruntled courtiers, merchants, prostitutes, everyone was a potential source. This web of intelligence gave him an almost supernatural advantage. He often knew of plots against him before the conspirators had even finalized their plans. At the center of this shadowy world was his enigmatic confidant, the Capuchin friar, François Leclerc du Tremblay, known to history as Père Joseph, the Gray Eminence. While Richelieu, the Red Eminence, moved in the open, Père Joseph operated in the shadows. He was the Cardinal's chief diplomat, secret agent, and propagandist, a man as fanatically devoted to the cause of the French state as Richelieu himself. He would appear in the courts of Europe as a humble friar, while secretly negotiating treaties, fomenting rebellions, and manipulating rulers. The relationship between the two men was a perfect embodiment of Richelieu's own dual nature, the public face of the Prince of the Church and the hidden gray shadow that did the devil's work for the good of the state. This mastery of intelligence was the invisible weapon that allowed Richelieu to anticipate his enemies, to divide them against each other, and to ruthlessly eliminate them before they could strike. The grand edifice of Richelieu's state, however, was built upon a foundation of immense human suffering, and soon the first cracks began to appear. His ambitious foreign policy and constant warfare were ruinously expensive. To fund the armies and the subsidies for allies like Sweden, Richelieu had to bleed the French people dry. The burden of taxation fell most heavily on the peasantry, who were crushed under the weight of taxes like the taille, the gabelle, salt tax, and a host of other levies. This relentless fiscal pressure ignited a series of massive, desperate popular uprisings that swept across France. In the southwest, the Croquants, crunchers, rose up by the tens of thousands, armed with scythes and hunting muskets, driven by starvation and fury at the royal tax collectors. In Normandy, the New Pieds, barefooted rebellion, sparked by a new salt tax, saw widespread violence. Richelieu's response to these cries of despair was not reform, but brutal repression. He dispatched royal armies to crush the revolts with exemplary violence, hanging leaders and burning villages. He saw these peasant uprisings not as a social problem, but as another form of sedition, another challenge to the authority of the state that had to be cauterized. While he was crushing the common people, his own body was beginning to betray him. The relentless strain of his work, the constant threat of assassination, and the endless political battles took a terrible toll. His migraines became more frequent and blinding. He suffered from agonizing fevers, painful boils, and a host of other ailments. The man who was trying to impose absolute order on the kingdom could not control the chaos within his own frail body. These were the harbingers of the storm, a populace seething with resentment, a treasury stretched to its limits, and a leader whose physical strength was beginning to crumble under the inhuman weight of his own ambitions. The most fateful act of Richelieu's career, the decision that would irrevocably define his legacy, was to plunge France directly into the 30 Years' War. For years, he had waged a proxy war, a brilliant and cynical strategy of funding others to fight the Habsburgs. His greatest tool in this was the military genius of the Swedish king, Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion of the North, whose Protestant army, paid for with French gold, had torn through the imperial forces in Germany. This policy was a masterpiece of Machiavellian statecraft, but it was also a profound scandal. A cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church was the chief financier of the most powerful Protestant army in the world, helping them to lay waste to the Catholic heartland of the Holy Roman Empire. This decision reveals the core of his political psychology. He was capable of a level of intellectual abstraction that few of his contemporaries could comprehend. In his mind, the confessional struggle between Catholic and Protestant was a secondary issue. The primary struggle was the geopolitical contest between the House of Bourbon and the House of Habsburg. He prioritized the security and glory of the French state above the unity of his own faith. This was the ultimate expression of raison d'etat. He was willing to be branded a traitor to his religion in order to be a savior to his nation. He calculated that a Habsburg victory in Germany would mean the end of France as an independent power. Therefore, any alliance, no matter how ideologically repugnant, was justified if it served the ultimate goal of weakening the Habsburg encirclement. This fateful decision to prioritize state over faith was his Rubicon. It plunged France into more than a decade of open, brutal warfare, and cemented his reputation as either a visionary statesman or a cynical, godless tyrant. The resolution of Richelieu's grand proxy war strategy came not in a triumph, but in a catastrophe that nearly shattered his life's work. On the 16th of November, 1632, at the Battle of Lutzen, his greatest weapon was broken. The Swedish army won the battle, but their king, the military genius Gustavus Adolphus, was killed on the field. The death of the Lion of the North was a strategic disaster for Richelieu. His entire anti-Habsburg policy had been built around the Swedes' peerless generalship. Without him, the Protestant coalition in Germany began to fracture, and the momentum of the war shifted decisively back in favor of the Habsburgs. Suddenly, the cardinal's brilliant, cost-effective strategy of paying others to die for French interests was in ruins. He was faced with a terrible choice: either accept a humiliating Habsburg victory that would leave France weaker than ever, or abandon the shadows of proxy war and commit French armies to the meat grinder of open conflict. This was the moment his great gamble failed. The personal catastrophe for Richelieu was the realization that he had lost control of events. He was no longer the puppet master pulling the strings from Paris. He was now forced to react to a crisis that threatened to consume everything. The pressure was immense. His health, always precarious, took a dramatic turn for the worse. The years that followed were a relentless grind of directing massive armies across multiple fronts, of desperately seeking new allies, and of raising ever more crushing taxes to pay for a war that seemed to have no end. The death of one man in a muddy field in Germany had forced the cardinal to stake the entire future of France on a direct, bloody, and hideously expensive roll of the dice. The final years of the cardinal's life were a grim paradox, a period of immense political and military power set against a backdrop of relentless physical collapse. From his sickbed, racked with fevers, migraines, and painful abscesses that sometimes left him unable to walk, Richelieu's mind remained a terrifyingly potent weapon. Surrounded by maps and dispatches, he directed the vast, complex machinery of the French war effort, his will projected across hundreds of miles to generals on the frontiers of Spain, Italy, and Germany. Yet, the closer he got to achieving his life's ambition of breaking the Habsburgs, the more the vipers coiled around him at home. The final great threat came not from a foreign army, but from within the heart of the court, in the form of the Cinq-Mars conspiracy. The Marquis de Cinq-Mars was a handsome, foolish young nobleman whom Richelieu himself had promoted, placing him as a favorite of the lonely King Louis XIII. But the young man grew arrogant, resenting the cardinal's power and dreaming of replacing him. He became the center of a dangerous plot that included the king's own brother, Gaston d'Orléans, and, most treasonously, involved a secret treaty with France's enemy, Spain. For Richelieu, this was the ultimate betrayal. He had nurtured this young man, only to have him turn and plunge a knife in his back. The discovery of the plot was a testament to the efficiency of his spy network. Even on the brink of death, his web caught the last of his enemies. He had the traitorous treaty intercepted and, with iron resolve, presented the proof to the king. The collapse of the conspiracy was his final bloody lesson to France. Cinq-Mars was beheaded, a chilling reminder that even the king's closest friend was not immune to the impersonal justice of the state. It was a lonely, bitter victory for a dying man who was now surrounded only by the ghosts of the enemies he had destroyed. The hero's finale came not on a battlefield, but in a richly decorated bedchamber in Paris on the 4th of December, 1642. The great cardinal was drowning, not in water, but in the fluids filling his own lungs. His body, which had been his lifelong enemy, had finally won its war against his indomitable will. Yet even in his last hours, the scene was not one of pious resignation, but of unrelenting statecraft. Propped up on pillows, surrounded by frantic doctors and grieving secretaries, his voice a dry rasp, he continued to dictate dispatches and give final instructions to his chosen successor, Cardinal Mazarin. He was ensuring that the great machine of the state he had built would continue to function without him. When the priests came to administer the last rites, they asked the question customary for all dying Christians. Did he forgive his enemies? Richelieu's reported response was the perfect, chilling epitaph for his entire life. "I have had no enemies," he whispered, "save those of the state." It was a statement of breathtaking arrogance and profound truth. In that final confession, he erased his own personality, his own grudges and ambitions, and fused his identity completely with the abstract entity he had served. He did not ask forgiveness for the blood he had spilled or the lives he had ruined, for in his mind, those actions were not sins, but necessary, righteous acts performed in the service of a higher good. His death was like his life, cold, calculated, and entirely dedicated to the perpetuation of the power he had forged. He died not as Armand Duplessis, but as Richelieu, a name that was no longer that of a man, but of an institution. The legacy of Cardinal Richelieu is a furious conflict of interpretations, a testament to the sheer scale of the revolution he wrought. For generations of French nationalists and republicans, from the revolutionaries of 1789 to Charles de Gaulle, he is the founding father of the modern French state. They see him as the visionary architect who took a fractured, semi-feudal kingdom and forged it into a centralized, powerful nation, laying the essential groundwork for the glories of Louis XIV and the future French Empire. In this narrative, his ruthlessness was a necessary evil, the harsh medicine required to cure a sick and dying realm. To the French aristocracy, however, both in his time and in the memory of their descendants, he was a monster, a red tyrant whose sole ambition was to destroy their ancient liberties and privileges. They saw him as a power-mad upstart who leveled their castles, executed their peers, and replaced the honorable bonds of feudal loyalty with a cold, bureaucratic despotism run by spies and tax collectors. To the Huguenots, he was the great persecutor who crushed their religious and political freedoms at La Rochelle. And to the wider Catholic world, especially in Rome and Madrid, he was a deeply scandalous figure, a prince of the church who betrayed Christendom for political gain, a cynical politician who put the interests of the French crown above the interests of the Catholic faith by allying with Protestant heretics. He remains a figure of profound ambiguity. Was he the ultimate patriot or the ultimate tyrant? The savior of the French nation or the creator of an oppressive state machine? The answer, it seems, depends entirely on whether one views history from the perspective of the state he built, or from the perspective of the people and institutions he crushed to build it. So we return to the core question. How did this frail churchman transform the poison of intrigue into a weapon for the French state? The final, comprehensive answer lies in the creation of a new political morality. Richelieu's genius was to take the dark arts of the Italian Renaissance, intrigue, espionage, betrayal, propaganda, which had always been used for personal or dynastic gain, and sanctify them by putting them in the service of a new, higher purpose. Raison d'etat, the reason of state. He solved the paradox of his position as a cardinal, waging unholy wars by effectively creating a new religion. The state became a mystical entity, with its own logic, its own morality, and its own right to survive and expand at any cost. This intellectual leap was his true revolution. When he persecuted the Huguenots, it was not for their faith, but because their political autonomy was a heresy against the unity of the state. When he executed the great Duke of Montmorency, it was not personal vengeance, but a necessary sacrifice to the principle of central authority. When he funded Protestant armies, he was not betraying God. He was performing a sacred duty to protect the state from the existential threat of Habsburg encirclement. By creating this powerful, impersonal ideology, he provided a moral justification for actions that would otherwise be considered sinful or tyrannical. Intrigue was no longer a grubby scramble for power. It was a sophisticated instrument for defending the national interest. He did not serve the king, Louis XIII, as a mere man. He served the immortal crown, the institution of which Louis was only the temporary vessel. This intellectual framework, this cold and terrifying logic, was the mechanism that allowed him to wield the most cynical of tools with the unwavering conviction of a true believer. Ultimately, the verdict of history on Cardinal Richelieu is that he was the principal architect of the modern sovereign state, with all its power, its glory, and its capacity for ruthlessness. His life is the universal lesson that the creation of political order is often a brutal and immoral process. He stands at the bloody crossroads, where the medieval world of personal loyalties and universal faith gave way to the modern world of impersonal bureaucracies and secular national interests. The struggle of his life was a testament to the idea that a state could be an entity with its own needs, its own ethics, and its own soul, entirely separate from the man who ruled it or the religion it professed. He demonstrated that for a nation to be strong, it might need to be willing to sacrifice not just the lives of its soldiers, but its own professed moral principles on the cold altar of geopolitical necessity. His legacy is the birth of realpolitik, the uncomfortable truth that international relations are governed not by laws or faith, but by power. He taught the world that a well-placed spy can be more valuable than a legion of soldiers, and that a subsidy to an enemy's enemy is the most efficient form of warfare. He crafted a state machine so powerful and so independent of the men who ran it that it would survive revolutions, outlast dynasties, and define the very character of France for centuries to come. The lesson of Richelieu is a chilling one, that the foundations of the orderly, powerful nations we know today may well have been laid by men who were willing to do the devil's work. And so, the final frame of this saga is not the man, but the symbol he left behind. It is the image of his magnificent scarlet robe, the robe of a cardinal, a prince of the church. But it is empty now, laid out in a darkened room in the Palais Cardinal. The frail, pain-racked body is gone, but the robe itself seems to radiate an aura of immense, impersonal power. It is no longer the vestment of a priest, but the uniform of a new kind of authority, the very embodiment of the absolute power of the state that he forged in fire and blood. This scarlet shadow would stretch far beyond his own life, casting its form over his successor, Mazarin, and ultimately providing the mantle of absolute authority that would be worn by the Sun King, Louis XIV. The Grand Palace of Versailles was, in truth, built upon the foundations laid by the cardinal. The image that stays with us is that of this empty robe, a haunting symbol of a state machine that had become more powerful than any single man, an institution that would live on, demanding loyalty, waging wars, and shaping the destiny of millions long after the heart of its creator had turned to dust. The flame over La Rochelle had not been extinguished. It had simply been used to light the great, cold, and magnificent bonfire of the modern French state.